Hey everyone, I'm Curtis,
And I'm Luke.
and we are the creators and hosts of the Panjwai Podcast. The Panjwai Podcast is an interview based podcast series that Luke and I are creating so that we can properly tell the story of our 2012 deployment to Panjwai, Afghanistan. Our goal is to bring on guests that were there with us or that were there before and after us to kind of shape the story of what we experienced and what the average infantryman experienced in the Panjwai District of Afghanistan. Our goal is to create a very human retelling of our experiences, but also be very succinct and descriptive in what we saw and experienced so that what we saw and experienced won't be lost.
Yes, it's something that we are both excited to share with anybody out there that's willing to listen. And, we have a lot of really interesting people coming up, and it's important for us to let you know that, this isn't just us telling our story. One of the reasons that we're doing this is because we understood the limitations of our own perspectives on this story. And so the end goal of this is to bring in these multiple layers of this incredible narrative to provide to you to listen to and to participate in. And so going down the road, Curtis and I will kind of set the stage, but then we'll have guests come on and we'll be again to really flesh out this story and hopefully provide this a really interesting perspective on this deployment for everyone.
Yeah, and whether it takes us a year or 6 months to tell this story, our goal is to tell the story and to tell it completely.
Yeah.
And we've both agreed that if we get to the moment that we're talking about some really off the wall topics with some really off the wall people, that probably is when we're going to stop. But for now, we're really excited to get into these stories, to talk to our guests, who most of whom are our friends and former coworkers,
Hmm.
and we're please bear with us as we go through these first two episodes. We're learning as well. But it is our hope that we can get the boring information out of the way first, and then we can launch straight into these interviews, which we think will be eye opening and very interesting to everyone involved.
Absolutely. And we appreciate everyone's support. We've already gotten a tremendous amount of support so far, but we're excited to see how things are going forward. And there's a lot of different ways you can do that. Number one way is just subscribe to the podcast and keep listening. Share it with people, and follow us on social media. And if you can, like and share a post and give us a follow on there, it's much appreciated.
All right, Panjwai Podcast in three, two, one. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode one of the Panjwai Podcast, featuring myself, Curtis Grace, and my best friend and co-host, Luke Coffey.
Hello, all. Luke here.
um, so we'll jump right into it. We're super happy to get started. We were just talking before we record.
Extremely.
We're actually a little bit nervous. So give us a break. This is episode one. So the way we want to open every podcast episode is we want to ask each of our guests, how they ended up here. So why they joined the army, why they joined the infantry, briefly how they ended up in Panjwai, and kind of what they're doing with their lives right now. So I'm going to turn it to Luke, and he's going to give you the rundown on Roy Luke Coffey.
So before we kick that off, we're here, we're starting this thing, and we're excited to have you guys listen. We're always open to feedback, and we're always looking forward to progress this thing into the next step. So we want you to be as involved in this process as possible. So to start things off, like why the army? I think it's a pretty simple answer for me, in that I had this lifelong ambition to join the military, and that went through many different shapes and forms between ages, 12 to 19 when I finally joined. But the short answer is that I joined the army because they let me choose my job versus other branches of the military where you're not guaranteed your job after, basic training or however they arrange it. And so when I was shopping around and I knew what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to do infantry stuff. I just didn't quite know, it was that 11 Bravo, MOS, that kind of thing. So I went to the recruiters, sat down with them. I'd done some research online, and I just sat right down with them at the desk, and they asked me what kind of jobs I was interested in doing. And I said, I want to be 11 Bravo. I want to be infantry. I know for sure that this is what I want to do because, when you're an 8-year-old kid playing army, you're playing infantry. And so uh, a good anecdote I'll tell on myself it's, I was sitting across the table from this guy, and his buddy was kind of standing over his left hand shoulder, and he said, "What do you want to do?" And I quote verbatim, and this is incredibly embarrassing. I said, "I want to be out the guy out there walking in the streets, kicking in doors." So they both looked to each other at this kind of smug grin of like, "Oh, we got this sucker." Next thing you know, I was shipping off to Fort Benning, Georgia for infantry school. Um, so, my life before the army wasn't that exciting. I just kind of grew up a traditional kind of American kid background. I grew up in a rural community on a working cattle and a tobacco farm, which was excellent, wonderful, and I enjoyed that part of my childhood very thoroughly. Um, but my life after the army has been a little bit more different. I got out in 2013, about 60 days after we got back from Afghanistan, and I transitioned directly into going to school. I went to school that August. So I got out in February, went to school in August, and started my education. And it's been a 7 year tumble and 8 or 9 months spent living in China, and moved to Colorado for my master's degree. And I just wrapped that up, and now I'm on the back end of the master's, graduated in May, and launching this project with my good man Curtis here. So that's the short version.
And trust me, it is the short
So
version.
Curtis, well, I feel like it's easier to get on to these rambling tangents, so apologize in advance for when those occasional, rambling moments pop up. So, Curtis, will give us your history, how you ended up in this position.
I mean, my short version is way shorter than your short version, so I'll give like the medium version. The short version is I was really bad at college. I was a really bright kid, but I just, apparently have to go to the classes, and I wasn't doing that. So I kind of had a choice. I could either keep spending money on student loans, or I could go do something and then maybe come back to college.
Hmm.
So I decided to start exploring joining the military, and kind of like Luke, the appeal of the army allowing me to choose my course was super appealing to me. But I also knew that my goals weren't just simply go in and join the army. I was looking at the potential of it being a career. And the two areas that really interested me most was special operations and then aviation.
Hmm.
And for both of those paths, I believed that joining the infantry was the best way to go. So unlike Luke's story where they're like, "We got a sucker," my recruiters tried to talk me out of joining the infantry many times.
No, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's they were like, "Well, the test scores were high because apparently if you try on the ASVAB, you score well." They're encouraging me to stay in school and come back as an officer or whatever, but I knew that wasn't going to do that. So I chose the infantry because I saw that as the best course to pursue my goals.
Hmm.
And I'm glad I did. It was absolute. I was right to do that. And I think there was a part of me that really wanted to go to war. That I didn't want to go into any of those more advanced positions without having that experience, having been
Yeah.
on the ground.
Yeah. And I think that's a pretty common core drive for every infantryman who joins it, with a kind of awareness of the significance of the job, is they join with this ambition, this kind of weird drive, this need to test your metal and to go to combat. And I think when you tell people that who aren't from that world, they think maybe it's a little odd or out of sorts to be like, "Yeah, I wanted to go to combat." But that's a pretty consistent thing across every infantryman's story, which makes it unique to how, when you finally get that experience, how each individual story unfolds.
Yeah, and I always like to tell people, the smartest people I've ever met in the military were in the infantry, like
Absolutely.
hands down, like the most intelligent people. And what I did after my 2 years in the infantry is I went and I became an Apache helicopter pilot. So like there was no shortage of big brains, flying the most advanced attack helicopter in the world.
Hmm.
I met some very bright people, but still the smartest people that I met had a CIB on their chest, not wings.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think you kind of touched on it. That kind of that battlefield intelligence. It just makes you stronger in every other job in the military.
Yeah. And one more thing about the infantry, is it is hands down the most diverse work environment you'll ever be in.
Oh
In
yeah.
terms of the people you interact with, you've got people from every kind of social and economic background. I mean, in one platoon, we had guys from the Philippines, guys
Hmm.
from everywhere from New York, Queens, street kids to California, and everything in between. We had guys from America Samoa, so it's an incredible experience in that you get plunged into this world where you all have this kind of unifying goal from all these different perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's probably no mistake that when you look at the higher echelons of army leadership, and it's shifting. There's a lot more non-infantry leaders,
Mm.
joint chiefs and stuff like that. But uh, in my opinion, the best ones have been former infantrymen. So, and then I left the infantry. I talking all these great things about it, and then I went and I became a Pogue. Uh,
Let's explain what a
which
pogue is to our uninitiated listeners.
That's true because it's going to come up a bunch. So Pogue is a personnel other than grunt, which is just a really, really nice way of saying not an infantryman. Trust me, there are more honest ways that we describe uh, those jobs. And then I went and I became one, uh, and I don't regret it.
Mm.
And I'm sure I'll get a lot of flack for it, and I deservedly so. But I'd like to think I was a special brand of Pogue. But
There you go. You're a pogue with the CIB on his chest.
I was a Pogue with a CIB on my chest, and I
Right.
also earned a cab, but I've never worn it.
Right.
I was never even awarded my cab. I just got a piece of paper, and that was it.
Mm.
But yeah, I went and I flew Apaches, and then I got out of the army in 2019. And then I went and worked for Amazon on their drone delivery program for a year before I decided that I wanted to go ahead and wrap up my education. So I did what the most reasonable person would do: is I moved to Alaska to do that.
Oh, I mean, I think that would be the next logical step, obviously. And I'm envious.
Yeah,
I think a
obviously.
lot of people are probably envious of you. All right. So, that's more or less our general histories. And I think one of the things we can just jump right into to the story of this deployment. Like all stories, the best place is to start at the beginning, which for us kind of starts a few months before, as every deployment does. Um, listeners might be wondering, like, what? How did a mechanized infantry unit end up in Afghanistan, or how did an armored battalion end up in Afghanistan? And so there's a few ways this happened, but essentially our unit got wrapped into the surge that President Obama came out and announced in 2011, if my memory serves me correctly.
2010 or
Yeah,
2011, I can't
so
remember.
we would kind of got wrapped up in this big push to send a lot of troops to Afghanistan, push the Taliban kind of out and back a little bit to give some breathing room for what was supposed to be the eventual withdrawal from there. So, we went to Iraq in 2009 and 2002, 2012, or sorry, 2009 to 2010. That was my first deployment, largely uneventful. We did have a few little incidences here and there, but I didn't even earn my CIB there. I never pulled the trigger in anger in Iraq after 12 months. And then we came back, and as soon as we came back, um, the rumor mill started churning about Afghanistan about 5 or 6 months after we got back. And so we, one thing that's important to point out is up to this point, third ID, which was, our division. So we were Bravo Company 164 Armor, 2nd Brigade Combat Team, 3rd Infantry Division. And up to this point, the only units from 3rd ID that had deployed to Afghanistan were aviation, as far as I'm aware. There might have been some random support units or something like that, but aviation was more or less the only significant portion of 3rd ID that ever went to Afghanistan.
Yeah,
And
at least
then,
at a battalion level, for sure.
yeah, yeah. And then we, a couple months before we deployed, our sister battalion, 130th, deployed, and they were the first infantry unit to go to Afghanistan from 3rd ID, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth kind of throwing out there that Third ID had such a heavy history in Iraq, and the mission in Iraq was kind of abruptly changed in 2011.
Hmm.
I think it was somewhere around October. President Obama said we were going to have all combat forces out of Iraq by the end of the year. Um, and to those who are kind of fresh in the military, they pretty much decide their deployment schedule years in advance, at
Yeah,
least 18 months in advance.
yeah,
So it's kind of my belief, and hopefully we can get somebody on here to confirm or deny that 164 was probably slated for another Iraq deployment in
yeah.
2012 initially.
Hmm.
And then when Obama announced the withdrawal forces from Iraq and the surge into Afghanistan, that our requirements got shifted. And that's probably how 164 ended up going to Afghanistan, especially going without the rest of their brigade, which is pretty unusual.
I mean, we had been back so we got our orders in November, and by that point, we'd been back for over a year. just over a year. We got back in October of 2010, and we got orders for Afghanistan just a couple weeks before Thanksgiving of 2011. And it was just this battalion formation. And the big red flag that went up for our company is we had this brand new company commander come down the pipe, and he was there for I'm not even sure, even a full month. I mean, maybe just 2 or 3 weeks. Is Captain Brian Kitching at the time. Now he's Lieutenant Colonel, right? And
Yep.
so he came to us and we'll have him on the podcast in the future, and he's going to be able to provide us a lot of interesting details and storytelling and things like that. So we're looking forward to having him on. But he came to us, and it was like this, this balls to the wall, go get him, you know, dude coming from Ranger Battalion to 3rd ID. And the first thing he did was start whipping us into shape. And before we got any official orders. And so that was a big red flag. Everybody's like, this has gotta be prep for Afghanistan. And sure enough, well, they rolled around a battalion formation, they dropped the orders, and everybody was pretty excited. We didn't know much about it. And so we were almost at the tail end of a gunnery, actually. We were getting ready to shoot the last few tables of the Bradley gunnery, and we just shifted gears right away and to training for light infantry because obviously we were going to Afghanistan. We weren't deploying as a heavy infantry unit. And we did the same in Iraq. We didn't deploy as a heavy infantry unit there either. But so we started doing all that. We got spun up for all this stuff. We started doing some field exercises. Our new CO smoked the crap out of us. And we went to NTC in February. And while we were in NTC, we were, we knew we were going to be going in March. We didn't have a specific day yet. And we were in NTC. We're about halfway through the month-long program out there at Fort Irwin, in California, which I'm sure that you former Army folks are well familiar with, or current Army folks are well familiar with. But we were we were out there. We're about halfway through this, and we had this interesting moment as a platoon. This is before Curtis got here, everybody. So this is why I'm rambling on for a minute. Sorry.
Yeah, I've got nothing to add to this
Yeah.
conversation.
So we had this interesting moment as a platoon, and that our platoon sergeant, who was first sergeant first class James Ott, who is now Command Sergeant Major James Ott. He gathered us all around, and he had this kind of like somberness about him, and we sat around in a circle, and he just broke it down for us. He's like, "This is where we're going. This is what's going on there." And he said, "This is going to be a fight." And he was telling us about how the Taliban were using IEDs, and we knew we were going to Panjwai, and I think at that point we even knew we were going to Sperwan Ghar. So we got this, yeah, we got this moment where it was this kind of eye awakening, like, oh shit, this is gonna be real. And it was really real when Sergeant kind of looked at us all and he said, like, we're gonna lose guys and we're gonna have people get wounded. And that was like, okay, this is the gravity of that moment was just like, this is gonna be real. This is the experience that everybody's, that initial drive to see combat, we were gonna get to see it. And so we hopped back to NTC, got back to Fort Stewart, and turned around a couple weeks later and deployed. And that's where you come into the picture.
Yeah. So there's like hidden history to this deployment that a lot of people weren't familiar with. Is that uh, I think 164 plussed itself up with almost 30 people straight out of basic training
Hmm.
right before we left between the four companies. And I was one of those guys. So I went to basic training in October 2011, and I graduated in February of 2012 while you were at NTC.
Hmm.
And this is another pretty interesting development. Kind of, I'm sure it's happened before, but I haven't heard of it. We got to the reception center, which is when you in process a new base, you kind of go through like a week to two of like in processing. They call it reception. And there was a lot of infantrymen there, probably 50 or 60 of us,
Hmm.
which to me wasn't. I mean, I just spent my entire last 4 months with a whole bunch of infantrymen, and we were going to the 3rd Infantry Division. I didn't think it was anything unusual to
Hmm.
have 50 or 60 infantrymen.
Yeah, when I went through, there was only maybe 10 or 11 of us out of a group of, I don't know how many hundred, probably.
Yeah, so I mean, that should have been a red flag right there. So after one of our morning PT sessions, and yes, I did once do PT. They basically said, "Hey, if you're not 11 Bravo, you can leave. Everyone's 11 Bravo, stand fast." And there were, like I said, 50 or 60 of
Mm.
us. Maybe less. Numbers change over time, but a good chunk, a full formation of guys. And then there's like, if raise your hand if you're married, or if you're a single father. And a bunch of people raise their hand, probably 15 people or so. Like, okay, you can leave too. And they're like, everybody else, your orders are being changed. You're going to 164 and you're deploying to Afghanistan in 3 weeks.
And for people who aren't in the military, that sounds really drastic and like, oh my god, I can't believe they would do that to these guys. But that happens all the time.
Yeah,
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 and it's also pretty common for you to get new privates midway through a deployment. So they'll guys will come to a third ID, for example. They'll go through in processing, and then 2 weeks later, like, oh yeah, by the way, you're going to join this unit who's been there for 6 months.
right. And they're gonna hate you when you show up because
Yeah,
they're all friends now, and now you're just gonna show up and mess everything up.
yeah.
Um, but so yeah, so obviously though, you guys were already in a TC.
Hmm.
You guys were already trained.
Hmm.
We were not. So basically, they took the 30 of us, and they also transferred some soldiers from First and 30th and some other battalions in the Third ID
Hmm.
for the deployment, mostly NCOs. And we did like a mini NTC. So we did like squad live fire, team live fire, platoon live fire, night shoots, ruck marches, PT tests. We did Rapid Field Initiative (RFI), which is where you get all your free stuff for the deployment. We did SRP, which is Soldier Readiness Processing,
Mm.
which you guys had done probably back in like
Yeah, we
December.
were doing that before Christmas.
Uh, yeah. So, and that's where they make sure you have your will and your shots are current and your administrative stuff is all lined up and that you're deployable. So it's quite a process, and it usually takes months. And we were basically
I
in
can't believe you
processing the
did it in
base.
that short amount of time.
It was fast. Yeah, I mean, we did
I
it
can't
very
believe it.
fast.
That proves that you don't need months and months and months and months to do this stuff, but we
No,
won't
it
go
was
down
probably
that
a
rabbit
month from
hole.
Flash Command. Yeah. I mean, it was
Uh,
probably a month from when they told us that we were going till the day we like arrived at the unit.
mm,
Um, and so we still had in processing to finish. We had all the pre-deployment training, which is a lot of PowerPoints and counter IED training and stuff like that. That's separate from the normal train up.
mhm,
And then there's 2 weeks of like civilian time when we actually showed up to the unit. But in reality, it was only 5 work days
mm.
because right before deployment, you go to 3 and 4 day weekends. So we were working like 3 days a week. So when we showed up on like a Tuesday, there were only like 4 or 5 more work days before we actually ended up deploying.
Yeah.
Um, and I'll never forget, they stood kind of a similar thing. They stood us up in front of all the companies in front of battalion. Um, they split us up by company. So I already knew I was going to Bravo at that point.
Mhm.
And the Bravo platoon sergeants stood out in front. I said, "Raise your hand if you have a higher than 270 score." And I raised my hand. Yes, I had a higher than 270 PT score. One, like it were 2 or 3 times ever. Um, and the one that asked me to raise my hand was at that time Sergeant First Class James Ott.
Mm,
And he's like, "You want to be in first platoon?" And I said yes.
yeah.
So I never even had an opportunity to be in another platoon because I just jumped right on the guy that scared the crap out of me, and
Yeah.
he was very intimidating
Well,
with the
yeah, I think he chose and you chose very well in that situation. I think that
yeah,
worked out really
yeah.
well.
I couldn't have picked a better company and platoon to
Yeah.
start my military career in.
Yeah, for sure.
And he definitely had a coffee mug still glued to his hand.
So
I never saw it leave.
for those of you who don't know James Ott, he lives off of coffee, and not like Folgers light roast. I'm talking the blackest black of coffee you can ever come across. And he had this plastic mug, and it was from Wawa gas stations, which are like a series of gas stations in the Northeast. And he would never wash it, and he would have me make his coffee on occasion. I think because I was his Bradley gunner, but also because my last name was Coffee, and I think he enjoyed the novelty of that. Uh, and so I would make his coffee, and it would have to be like you could stick spoon in it, it'd stand straight up in it, and you look into that mug, and it was like looking into the abyss. So,
And it did not matter how hot it was.
no,
Like I saw that man drinking that coffee in a grape field, 120 degrees outside.
yeah,
Just
Yeah.
love coffee. It's the way,
One of
and I understood it later when I became a pilot. That the army runs on melatonin and it runs on coffee. Coffee to wake you up and melatonin to put you to sleep. So that more or less that's where kind of where our stories come together. That is when I reported to the unit, and that's when I met most of the people that we're going to talk about during this podcast. And that
Mhm.
is where the story of Bayonet Company, First and 64th Armor Regiment, 2012 Operation Enduring Freedom starts. Really,
Yeah. Yeah, it does.
which kind of leads us into where did we go? Uh, because we're gonna talk a lot in the podcast about specific locations, comp names, district names, and it will get understandably confusing. And we
Mm,
will try to keep like a published product on the website and on the podcast page, so you can refer to it while you're listening. So like if you get turned around, you can look at basically a map or a legend. But we kind of want to orient our listeners onto this area that we lived, worked, played, fought, bled, and died. Obviously, not us, but brothers that we lost on this somewhat hollowed ground. And we just want to take the moment to kind of orient you onto what Sperwan Ghar and Panjwai was.
yeah.
And we'll try to keep it brief, but Panjwai is a district. So if you think about United States, if the United States is a country just like Afghanistan, then the provinces are going to be the states. So that would be Kandahar province. Um, Panjwai district was in Kandahar province. So if you think about the districts as like counties, so Panjwai was like being in a county of a state. Sperwan Ghar, where we lived and worked, was a combat outpost in Panjwai. Panjwai is a good bit larger than the area we're going to talk about for the most of the podcast.
Yeah.
But if you kind of envision a square area of land, but at the top left corner of that square, you put like a horn from a
A
like a
cornucopia.
muskox or cornucopia. That's a really good
Yeah, that's what it
example.
always reminds me
Just
of.
Yeah, so I mean, really wide at the on the eastern end, but narrowing and coming up to a tip and kind of curving. And it forms a tip at the end.
Yeah.
And that's called the horn of Panjwai. And that when people talk about being in Panjwai or fighting in Panjwai, 9 out of 10 times they're talking about being in the horn of Panjwai.
Yeah. Which is just the last few kilometers of the entire district because there's
Yeah.
a lot of things that are going on there. It's narrowing down. So in this east to west trajectory, it's as it narrows down these two rivers, the Argam Dab is kind of the northern border and it's coming down. And then on the south border of the district, you have what's called the Registan or Red Desert. And this is nothing but sand dunes. It looks like the surface of Mars between Panjwai and the border with Pakistan, which is one of the reasons why Panjwai was such a hot spot. Is because they could get in and out of Pakistan fairly easily by crossing the desert. So you have this elongated horn coming to a point, and then those final few kilometers, what maybe 20 clicks,
Yeah, if even that.
if even that, was where the vast majority of the fighting in Panjwai went on because not only did the desert provide access for Taliban to move back and forth, it was also really close to Helmand. As the crow flies, it's not very far from these really hard fights that the Marines had in 2010 in Sangin and places like that.
Yeah. And there's another southern river, and you kind of mentioned it,
Oh yeah, I forgot.
called the Dowry Rood. And the Dowry Rood was mostly dry during the summer,
Yeah,
so it wasn't really a terrain feature that was insurmountable for us. Not like the Argadab. I mean, the Argadab is a wide
yeah,
river. You had to have bridge. There's no way you could swim or drive across. It was just a big, deep river. And Dowry Rood wasn't like
no,
that. So yeah, like Luke said, yeah, kind of these two rivers come into a junction, and then to the immediate west of Panjwai, you had Maiwand district, which just kind of like Panjwai, most of the fighting is in that green zone that's near the Arghandab River.
hmm,
And then you keep following that Maiwand district down. That's when you get to Helmand.
yeah,
Um, but going back to Panjwai, so you got the northern edge, Arghandab River, southern edge, Rajasthan Desert, and Dali Rood. There are some mountains kind of sprinkled in there, but they're not really dominant terrain features or really even that relevant because no one was in them.
Yeah, I mean they're really mountains so much as just crags. You know, there was these incredible vertical cliff faces that just went straight up to a point and back down, and it was more of these ridge lines. And you couldn't really climb up them without ropes and equipment. Things like that.
Yeah, and it wasn't like Eastern Afghanistan where people lived there.
Yeah.
No one wanted to live on the side of a cliff face, so they were largely irrelevant, except just kind of serving as like boundaries for certain areas of the operations. Um, so Panjwai, it doesn't take too much imagination to see what it probably looked like before it was irrigated. It was probably just like the areas of Kandahar and southern Afghanistan that aren't irrigated.
Hmm.
Kind of a lot of wide open desert, some scrag brush, maybe a couple areas of vegetation where there's water or wells, but for the most part pretty dry and open. But at some point, somebody irrigated it, and when they did, they basically created this agricultural oasis
Mm.
between these two rivers. And they put irrigation canals in, they put wells in, they ran miles and miles and miles of aqueducts and canals and whatnot. And what they got was a really fertile growing area. Uh, so we weren't really prepared for that.
No.
We were thinking we were going to be in the
And then
mountains.
yeah. Okay, so you hear Afghanistan, and as an infantryman, your first thought is like, "Fuck, we're gonna be humping gear up and down mountains all day
Right.
long." So it was a shock to our systems to get to Panjwai and see that it was flat. Like everywhere that we walked was flat, because it's in this valley between these rivers.
And flat is even it looked flat,
Yeah,
We landed, it looked flat. We're
yeah,
like, "Oh, well, this is gonna be easy. We're fine. We don't have to climb any mountains." Uh, and Luke's laughing because it was not flat.
no,
I would argue we probably climbed tens of thousands of feet of elevation in an area that was probably below, like,
yeah,
it wasn't below sea level, but I mean, we didn't climb up any mountains, that's for
no,
sure. Um, and the reason was, just kind of like primal medieval architecture.
yeah,
We weren't dealing with a overly developed area. Most of the construction techniques in the area are, mud or literal, manure or human waste or animal waste. Um, so they would dig. So the way that they would dig, canals, or they would dig their fields for grapes. So if you thinking about a grape field, if you go to Napa Valley, California, you see all these grapevines hanging over fences or wires, these very fancy things. Well, the Afghans didn't have that, nor did they want that. Basically, they would just plow parallel rows, or by plow I mean dig parallel
by hand,
ditches
yeah,
into the ground by hand, 4 or 5 feet down into the ground. And I'd say, in an acre, you'd probably have 10 parallel rows,
yeah,
6 feet apart, with a 6 foot mound in between them.
hmm
And they
and
would lay the grape vines across that mound, and that was their grape field.
yeah, and grapes were a huge part of the agricultural system there, and these grape fields would be the way they would design them is they would be these squares, and they might have been like the biggest ones might have been 2 or 3 acres at
If even,
max.
yeah.
It probably not even
Mhm.
that, like the more or less around an acre, and then these grape fields would be squared off with what we call goat paths, which are these little footpaths that they would use between them that would run along the top of these walls. And so essentially what was created is in the more irrigated areas were these series of parcels of squares where when you were moving through it, you would go open over a wall, drop down, walk between these two other walls, and then you would go up and over a wall and 40, 50 meters, and you do the same thing again. And so you climb these walls all day long whenever you're maneuvering there. And that's a pretty serious kind of terrain to deal with when you're trying to fight, which we'll talk about obviously in more detail later.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning that we're talking about going in and out of these roads, and if you weren't there or if you're not familiar with the area, you're probably wondering why we didn't just walk on those paths, and we'll get to that later.
Yeah.
There's a very good reason why we weren't walking on the paths.
Yeah.
But like Luke said, I mean, you go up and over a wall, and you're down into basically a trench, and then you're walking a trench for 100 meters, and you're up and over a wall, and maybe you're going in and out of a irrigation canal, and then you're into an orchard, and then what you run into are what were called Kalats.
So another part of the agriculture there, there's three main things that are going on. The grapes are a significant portion, but they also grew a large amount of poppy, which is used, in the heroin production, which is a primary source of income for the Taliban, and they grew a boatload
Mhm.
of marijuana.
Oh
And
yeah,
so the poppy and marijuana were actually in these wide open fields. And so and they were kind of interspersed through these grape fields. So they didn't have the walls. They would be
right.
surrounded by walls, but the field itself would be flat. So all you had was concealment when you crossed those fields. You didn't have any cover at all. And then there were also closer in towards the Kalats, there was uh, orchards of pomegranate trees. And these orchards are relatively small, but really dense, really heavy vegetation. And they were usually closer in towards the villages.
Yeah, that's a good point. You know, it was a heavy agricultural area, and they had all these fields. And obviously, the grape rows they could only use for grapes because just the unique nature of how you have to grow grapes and
Mm,
hang vines and stuff. But those open fields that Luke's talking about, we would see them rotate different crops through those fields
hmm
all year round.
Yeah,
When we first got there, they were poppy fields. And then after the poppy season was over, then they became cornfields or wheat fields. And then later in the summer, they would become marijuana fields.
yeah,
I mean, they pretty much grew marijuana year round, but they
yeah,
would rotate a lot of the more formal fields through a whole bunch of different crops.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, interspersed in all these fields were these little clusters of mud hut villages. So follow us on Instagram; you'll see plenty of pictures of them. Generally, they were 1 or 2 stories tall, and they would build them in a kind of four. They would have four sides, and then they have a shared courtyard in the middle, and there might be 1 or 2 ways in and out of these. And sometimes they were larger, sometimes they were smaller, but these would be a cluster of these little compounds uh, in various size, and that would form a colot.
Yeah, and like, I'd say probably what the average one had 10, 15 buildings in it max. And
Sure.
by buildings, I mean compounds.
Yeah.
The bigger ones might have a mosque or a school. And you would see evidence of a former attempt to kind of modernize the area, just random concrete schoolhouses or concrete buildings that kind of don't match the rest of the architecture.
Yeah, you'll be walking through in a schoolyard, and you'll say like, "Man, this looks out of place." And there'll be a little well there, and there'll be in the concrete. It'll say UN 1991
70
or
or yeah,
something, or
90 or something. Yeah.
1979. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know the full story, and maybe we'll be able to explore at some point. But there was definitely a very big effort by the UN and the United
Yeah.
States to irrigate and develop the area. There's schoolhouses, there's buildings. The one that we stayed in on Sperwan Ghar was built by the UN.
Yeah.
The wells and dams. I mean, there's a huge dam on the Arghandab River. There's a huge dam in Helmand that was built, back in the 70s as well to create these agricultural zones in Helmand and in Panjwai. And it's a pretty fascinating history that I don't know as much about as I'd like,
Mhm.
but it's clear that at one point this area was not this dense agricultural zone. It was created to
Yeah.
create, this industry. So yeah, we've got the Kalats, these villages kind of interspaced, and they were all named. Whether the names that we gave them were the names that the locals called them, uh, probably about 50-50.
Mhm.
Some of them were pretty well-known villages like Sketcha, Najat, Paimaluk. Those are, you know, we would hear the same verbiage from the locals when they were describing things, and the words would come up. So they were pretty consistent. But some of the smaller villages, I think, were probably misnamed, or multiple villages had the same name, kind of thing.
Mhm.
So you got this huge agricultural zone with all these different kinds of fields and like villages interspaced throughout. And I believe the population of Panjwai is something like 25,000 people. It's a
Yeah.
huge number of people in a very, very small area.
Yeah, it's pretty significant. And these villages were usually, there was never one big concentration of population. The biggest villages maybe had a few hundred people in them. So they were really spread out over the entirety of the Horn. And so these villages were never, these Kalats, they were never more than 200 or 300 meters away from each other. And especially as you got closer to the northern end of the district, where the one asphalt road in Panjwai that actually didn't even go all the way out to the tip of the Horn that came in from Kandahar was Route Hyena. And then
Yep.
there was a little T, if you make you a T shape, the bottom of that T that went down to Sperwan Ghar was Route Brown, and that was asphalt. But other than
Yep.
that, there was not a single square inch of asphalt in Panjwai
There's
or
one
in
more.
the Horn. Yeah, oh yeah, there
Yeah,
is
well,
one more.
there
Yeah.
were 2 more. There was Route Quebec, which was
Yeah.
just to the west of Sperwan Ghar, and that went to Fob Zangabad.
Mhm.
Which is Fob Zangabad was the battalion headquarters for 1st and 23rd Infantry, which we for totally skipped over mentioning. We weren't attached to 164. So we were Bravo Company 164, but we got detached from 164 and attached to 123 Infantry out of Fort Lewis. So while we were still from 164, we took all our orders and we worked for 123, and they were out of Zangabad. There was one other asphalt road just to the east of the bazaar, which is another significant feature of Panjwai, and that went down towards Najat, and that was paved
Yeah.
about half the way down until it got blown up like 5 times.
Yeah, so Route Brown and, um, what was the one next to Najat? What was it called?
I honestly don't remember that one.
I can't remember, yeah.
Yeah,
Route Brown and that one were more or less the kinda eastern half of our AO, and that's where we did most of our operations was in that eastern chunk.
yep.
For our intents and purposes, Route Brown is a significant part of the story of Sperwan Ghar, and it'll come up multiple times, so we won't go into detail here. But that's something to stick in your mind.
It's definitely worth it to kind of remember these names. And like I said, we're going to throw up maps and we're going to show up pictures so that you can orient yourself. But Route Hyena has a huge significance to like our Canadian counterparts who we took over
Mm,
from. Um, in 2011, Americans took over at Panjwai, but from 2006 to 2011, it was a Canadian AO.
mm,
So that's why you have Route Quebec, and Hyena was a big project for the Canadians because before that it was way too dangerous for them to keep driving up and down Panjwai. They were just getting messed up, so they needed that big
mm,
paved MSR to safely move. So I think that kind of somewhat covers the geography. Kind of briefly cover the military history. If
mhm,
those of you have read Lions of Kandahar by Rusty Bradley, it kind of covers how Canadian American forces pushed into Panjwai for the first time in 2006 and took it. And it's a fantastic book. Can't recommend it enough.
yeah,
So from 2006 to 2011, the Canadian forces owned Panjwai. They lived at Sperwan Ghar, they lived at Mazamgar, they lived at all these fobs and cops. And then in 2011, Americans took over. And there was one unit before us that took over in 2011 that we took over from. We held Sperwan Ghar for 9 months and Panjwai with 123. And then the unit that replaced us actually shut down Panjwai and Sperwan Ghar. So a very, very brief military history for American forces in Panjwai.
and I think that's why a lot of folks really haven't heard of it. I mean, I think if you're in certain circles, you know what Panjwai is, but if you walk into, if you talk to someone who is maybe interested in military history or there's a particular conflict, like they'll know what Sadr City is and people know what Korangal is and they hear about these big spots in Afghanistan. But, they don't really that doesn't really blip on the radar because it was held up either by the Taliban for so long, such a long period of our investment in there, but it was also held by Canadian forces, so and it was a different kind of fight, up into 2010 when the Marines moved into Helmand, the only people who had fought the way that we would fight in Panjwai was the Canadians and the British out in Helmand.
Yep.
And so the Marines were the first ones to get a taste of this kind of like different kind of Afghanistan fight, which was no longer, you know, big battles across mountain valleys when they're 600 meters away to these, close ambushes and IEDs and all this stuff.
Yeah, but the Sperwan Ghar area had its own little history prior to even the Canadians moving in, and that was kind of illustrated in the Lions Kandahar. But we haven't really talked much about Sperwan Ghar. So, Luke, could you give us a little bit of info about the hill itself?
Sperwan Ghar is more or less in the middle of the Horn, maybe just a little bit to the right of the middle of the Horn of
Sure.
Panjwai.
Hmm.
And so you'll see in our pictures and you'll see, if you look on Google Maps, even you can see it. It's this hill. It's this random dirt hill that's probably 100, 150 feet tall in the middle of this flat river valley. And it was actually built by the Russians during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989. And in the very top of this hill, there's a road that went around the base and kind of spiraled up to the top. And the very top of it was an old bunker. that the Russians had built. As far as I know, the Russians built that bunker.
Yeah, they did.
And so there's this bunker and a kind of small bunker system there. And then it's essentially served as a point of domination for the entire district, and that you could set arty, or you could set your tanks up there and do some work, which I'm sure the Russians did. Uh, and so it was not a natural terrain feature for us to have this hill, and but it also worked incredibly well to our advantage in that it put us in a kind of central location. We had a route of asphalt going and connecting to Hyena instead of dirt, because dirt means IEDs in Afghanistan. It's a little bit different. We'll get into the IEDs later about how they work there, but it also it saved us a lot of trouble on our cop actually getting hit, because it was essentially a fortress. It was almost impenetrable. There was 2 or 3 gates of security. There was Afghan security contractors that ran all the security on the kind of outer perimeter, and then you had to get through an A&A compound, and then you had to come up to where we were situated. And so we lived between kind of hooches that we had made and constructed, or the Canadians probably constructed, and this concrete school that the UN had built, I think in the 90s, before the Taliban took over, that the UN had built. Unfortunately, we got to live in the concrete school, which was nice because it had air conditioning, and and we can talk a little bit more detail about that first impression of Sperwan Ghar. The short version is that as soon as I got off the helicopter, I was like, "Dude, this is nice." Because I heard Afghanistan, I was thinking cots and tents, which is what a
Yeah.
lot of guys in the infantry have to deal with when they deploy to Afghanistan. We got really lucky in terms of our living quarters and
Well, even
situation.
at like Zangabad and Talakan and Mushan, those dudes were living in GP mediums,
Tent,
sleeping on cots. Like,
yeah, yeah. Yeah, we got lucky, and we were also lucky in that it was an easily defendable position. So a lot of cops out west of us would get hit almost every day. There was an ALP checkpoint, an Afghan local police at a checkpoint that was constructed while we were there, and as soon as the HESCOs went up, actually while the HESCOs were going up, they were getting hit, and the Taliban were sneaking there at night and planting IEDs. There was an ODA team captain that actually got hit by an IED and lost his legs out there, unfortunately.
yeah,
Um,
yep,
so that little checkpoint got hit every single night. And if we had been down on that level playing field instead of having that elevation, because our guard towers are probably a good 20, 30 feet above the Grapefields, then we would have gotten hit every single night. So they didn't. They only hit the cop once or twice, and it was kind of middling at that. They didn't really try to actually fight us.
yeah. Our response to those attacks was so overwhelming. It was, I mean, they'd shoot like a grenade at the cop, and we'd have 50 people on the roofs just like spraying the general vicinity where it came from. And that's not to
Yeah,
say that we were indiscriminately firing. We weren't.
no,
It was just
no.
extremely disproportionate. And like you said, I mean,
I
it's
think
a fortress.
yeah, it is, and I think they learned a lesson on that, and they never really mess with us there.
So what we wanted to talk about next was kind of a brief history. We've talked about military history of the Panjwai. We talked about the topography of Panjwai. We talked about Sperwan Ghar in particular. But now we're going to look at the enemy that we were fighting, and at the time, and still, I'm sure, the dominant enemy in Panjwai is the Taliban. And what a lot of people may not know is that Panjwai is where the Taliban originated. More specifically,
Mm,
Panjwai used to be a good bit larger. It used to include the district to the north on the northern side of the Arghandab called Zari. So when Panjwai was one, when it was both of those districts, the Taliban originated in that area. And I've heard two stories. I've heard that they were in Zari, or I've heard that they're in Panjwai. So for sake of argument, it was Panjwai at the time. So it was one of the two. And essentially, after the Soviets left, there was just kind of this power vacuum. There's a bunch of warlords, kind of tribalism, and basically what happened was the warlords went a little bit too far. They kind of exceeded what the religious scholars in the area believed was acceptable, and they staged a revolution. And that revolution became the Taliban. And it's actually kind of ironic to me that a moral issue is what caused the Taliban to rise,
mm,
and they then became probably one of the most immoral ruling bodies in modern history, at least according to Western standards.
and this is in
And
1994 that they come to power.
yeah, yeah. So I believe like the revolution in Panjwai it wasn't very long before they actually became like the
Like
dominate.
the state power. Yeah.
Yeah, it was pretty quick. They kind of like got a taste of
Mm.
power after they took over Panjwai. Like, well, we could do this everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a really good book about the period of time after the Soviets left till 2000 to September 10th, 2001 by a former CIA guy, maybe I think a CIA analyst or something. It's called Ghost Wars, and he talks a
Mhm.
lot about how the Taliban came to power. And that's been years since I read it before we left
Yeah.
for the deployment. So it's been almost 10 years since I read it, but that's a good book for people to check out if they're interested in that story.
Yeah, so feel free to read it and then fact check us in the comments
Yes,
because
please do.
we would love to make sure we're getting it right. So if we're getting anything wrong, don't hesitate to reach out and tell us we're messed up. Um, so yeah, I mean, and from that moment on, I mean, it was not only a Taliban held area, it was a Taliban stronghold. And that was evidenced by the
And
way
a
that they
spiritual
constructed.
homeland.
Mhm. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, it was evidenced by the way that they built their buildings in this area of the country. Everything was a compound. Everything had, basically firing positions. Every building you could get on the roof and use it as a fighting position. Like, I've never been somewhere and looked like every building is essentially a fortress.
Yeah.
Uh, so when in 2006, NATO, or yeah, it would have been NATO at the time. NATO's like, we're
Mhm.
going to take Panjwai back. They fought so hard to take Panjwai, and that
Yeah.
again, Lions of Kandahar is the book to read to get that full story. But it
Mhm.
was a brutal fight, and particularly the fight to take and hold Sperwan Ghar was a brutal fight because that was a Taliban position, and they had the high ground, they had the fortress, and it was just a special forces ODA that took it, and that was kind of
With
the
their
end of.
A&A counterparts.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that was kind of the end of the Taliban's, at least overt control of Panjwai. And for those interested, uh, you know, obviously we left in 2013. Panjwai, we no longer had operational control, handed over to the Afghans, and in 2017, when I was there, uh, it was completely peaceful. There was no Taliban activity at all.
Mm.
Um, So obviously, you draw your own conclusions, and there's a lot of theories that it's basically just kind of like a deal behind closed doors, and that the Taliban's still really in charge. They just don't fight there, which I would believe.
Mhm.
Um, but
And you flew over
so
Sperwan Ghar as well when you went back in 2017.
yeah, I did a
And you
couple
said it
times.
was just like a ghost town, right?
Yeah, yeah. So Sperwan Ghar in 2017, there were a couple Humvees on the base. Didn't look like they were really using it, but it's kind of hard to say. So,
Yeah. Hmm.
but we'll talk about that another time, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But
So I think one of the central focuses of this podcast is going to be, the infantryman's story, the grunt, the daily grind of that infantry job. But one of the things that's really, really important, the and crucial components of this story is all of our people that we have with us in terms of like attachments. We have these enabling assets, and so let's take a minute to kind of paint a picture for people. You have the infantryman who's out there doing the fight, but then you have all of these people who are attached either directly or indirectly to this system that helps us fight. And so let's take a minute to kind of describe that web of connection for people. That way, the people who aren't really familiar with how that stuff works, they can get a brief introduction to it.
yeah, and it's worth mentioning a lot of the assets we're going to describe are typically only available at much higher levels than an infantry company.
Mm,
Usually, these are brigade or division level assets that you have to request or wait for. But due to the nature of the fight in Panjwai, and it was similar for other units like Inzari and Maiwa and Helmand, they had to separate these units out. And when we talk about
mm.
this, we're talking about signals intelligence teams, explosive ordnance teams, military working dog teams, female engagement teams. Uh, what else did we have?
We had a PA on our cop,
Yep, yep.
which was unheard of to have act like a medical officer on a company level cop. You typically you just have your medics.
hmm Yeah. So I mean, we had a lot of assets that I don't think were typical. Again, peering through a straw, we were infantrymen at a different time in the war, so maybe it was more typical than I thought. But based on talking to other veterans, these are generally like battalion or higher level assets that we had available on our combat outposts. They lived with us.
Yeah. Yeah, and we had, the the two crucial components of all this for our fight was EOD and the military working dogs. And we're going to be talking a lot about EOD and the MWD guys. The EOD guys, they came from, we had Air Force guys out there, we had Army. They were all, for the most part, like these were really squared away dudes, and they helped us tremendously in our effort because the IEDs were such a hard part of our fight. And so EOD and the military working dog teams were both, they were out there with us almost every single patrol. And these teams would get stretched thin because there would be one team that might have a couple of three dogs, maybe two dogs, and then the EOD guys might be a team of 4 or 5 guys, and they would go out with us, they go out with second, they go out with third platoon. So these were important part of this picture that we paint. And I always will have a soft spot in my heart for the military working dog guys because, and sorry, Army, you're gonna have to take a hit on this one, but hands down, the most professional, determined, hardest fighting, diligent, resilient military working dog teams we had came out of the Navy and the Air Force. And these guys joined not expecting to be put on the front line of combat. Like they joined to essentially be, they'd be out sniffing ports and these
Checkpoints
big
and
events,
yeah.
and yeah. And so they got shipped to us and attached to us, and then they were right there with us in this infantry fight, and they were awesome. And then the
Yeah.
EOD guys, same thing, man. They were awesome.
Yeah, I mean, my experiences with the military working dog teams, I mean, that I ended up adopting a military working dog, a retired one. I mean, and those interactions had a huge effect on me personally, especially on an emotional level, just to have those animals on the cop and have such
Mm,
easy access to them. Like, if you had a bad day, I mean, I would walk down, I'd go to the dog handler hooch, and I would just play with the dog. And you'd be
mm,
amazing the amount of morale that can, how that can save you from a very dark place after a very horrible day. Um, so just outside from their physical capability, which that they brought to the fight, which was immense, just kind of being a lame-o dog person, it was a big deal to me.
yeah, it was cool. It was nice to have
Yeah,
them there in a lot of capacities, and we'll talk more in detail, especially when we have a couple of those guys on here about what those dogs do and how they work,
yeah.
and really impressive, kind of asset that they brought to the battlefield for us.
And they also, them and the EOD teams, they gave us the unique opportunity to train with them. So
Hmm.
when you have these assets at like a battalion or brigade level, and you have to request them, or you only get them on occasion, you only really get to work with them. But since they lived with us, we could train with them.
Yeah.
So we could practice clearing buildings with the dogs. We could have the EOD team come down to the range and run a IED lane and teach us what to look for and teach us
Hmm.
how to use the equipment better and teach us the TTPs and the signs to look for. And they made, us much better at our job of looking for IEDs than simply having to call them anytime we found one, because it just wasn't
Hmm.
it wasn't reasonable for us to be able to do that when they only had 4 guys.
Yeah. Yeah. And, traditionally, like in Iraq, for example, for at least from my experience, and other people can, please do chime in on this, but you'd be out on patrol and you might find a suspected, IED. You would usually call in EOD and they would come from somewhere else. They'd drive in. You'd sit there for a couple, 3 hours. They'd drive a robot out there. They'd rig it all up and they'd blow it, or they'd dig it up. If it was an IED, you'd move on. And then they'd go back to base and you would continue mission.
Right.
But for us, because Panjwai, and specifically the Sperwan Ghar AO, was inaccessible by vehicle. Um, so you had this, and we actually need to get on Google Maps and draw a square around it just to kind of get a sense of the square mileage or square kilometer of this dense agricultural infrastructure and these mud hut Kalats that were not accessible by anything other than a motorcycle and maybe one or two roads, maybe a little rinky-dink car, but you sure as hell weren't driving by a Mat V down
Right.
them. So that's why these guys went on patrol with us, they fought with us and everything like that because when we found those IEDs, they needed to be there with us to immediately take care of the issue instead of having to wait because we couldn't wait because if we would have waited, we would have been fighting all the time while we waited.
Which is a really good transition to our next topic, which is IEDs. Uh,
Oh, fuck.
I mean, so when you say that IEDs were a big deal on our deployment, a lot of people are going to go to Iraq in their minds. They're going to go
Mm,
to Iraq and think about, tanks hitting IEDs or Bradleys being turned inside out by these 600 pound IEDs. And that's not what we mean.
mhm.
At one point in Panjwai, it was that. It was these former, improvised charges that were like derelict Soviet munitions or whatever. But by the time we got there, it had shifted to homemade explosives. There was a whole bunch of basically Timothy McVeighs out there making bombs out of household materials.
Yeah,
Um,
and a lot of them too.
a
So,
lot, yeah,
in Iraq, the concern was always these big, huge, V-bids that would come up and just annihilate a truck full of people or whatever. But in that, in Panjwai, and actually all across that whole area of Afghanistan, down the helmet especially, the IEDs weren't these big, huge 150, 200, 400 pound explosions. They could be 5 pounds of this homemade explosive. The bigger one that would be in the ground would be like 20 pounds. That would be a big IED for us to find,
yeah,
because the idea was to, it wasn't an anti-vehicle operation. It was an anti-foot, patrolling infantry, kind of fight for them.
yeah. And it was really, that was the best way for them to meter their resources. If they could only
Hmm.
make, 500 pounds of IEDs in a month, well, why would they put them all into one bomb when there's a low chance that that's actually going to do anything? Whereas they
Yeah,
could put 50, or I guess 100 5-pound IEDs all over the ground, and all they got to do is get one guy. It doesn't even matter if they
yeah,
kill him. They take a leg off, they stop a patrol, a helicopter has to be called in,
hmm,
and suddenly this opportunity to kill one guy turns into the opportunity to either shoot down a helicopter or pin down an American patrol or stop them from getting to an IED factory and give you time to get the rest of your guys to get out of the way. It was just a much better use of their resources,
yeah,
and it worked. I mean, it completely affected our ability to move in that battle space.
yeah. And it's important that we address the tactics that the IEDs, and how they informed our tactics, but also how the Taliban were just so savvy with how they placed them that they knew how to kind of counteract our tactics. So, for people who aren't familiar with how infantry works, you when you're in combat, your first day in basic training, the first thing you learn is these three little words: shoot, move, and communicate. And the key word to that being move. And so infantry instills in you that when you start taking contact, you begin maneuvering. You push and you flank and you do bounds and you suppress. One unit suppresses while the other moves under, their suppression into an enemy position and clears it. And the idea is that you have these little puzzle pieces, rather these chess pieces. That's called the queen of the queen of battle.
Queen of battle.
Which is, yeah. But the infantry is these little chess pieces of a fire team, a squad, a platoon that you can maneuver in this space to conquer the enemy. Well, the IEDs completely robbed us of that ability of maneuverability. It forced us to not be able to spread out and walk in a wedge or walk in a particular kind of formation. It forced us to go on a file, in a straight line down the middle. Because if as soon as we started to spread out, people would step on these things because they'd have them placed in these kind of integral points in these intersections and everything. So, Curtis, give us a quick rundown on how they were placed.
So without giving too much away, and we always got to remember we still have people downrange, so we're trying to be very vague about some of this stuff. But
Hmm.
I always like to envision the Taliban as hunters. And if you spend any time with like big game hunters, the way they track their prey is they look for where they would naturally go. So natural lines of travel, natural choke points, water sources, all these kinds of things that animals are generally drawn to. The Taliban would do the same thing. They would take human nature into account. We're lazy. We're going to take the path of least resistance.
You're
If
tired.
you're tired, you're walking down a road, or you have to walk through an intersection, or you have to cross a bridge, or that kind of thing. So they're looking for these natural choke points, these natural routes of ingress, um, and that's where they would put them. It wouldn't
Mm,
be worth their investment to just start just laying landmines all over Panjwai. Maybe in a different war it might have, but in this war we're fighting an insurgency. So the Taliban, even though they did a pretty poor job of it, they still wanted to try to protect the local population. So little kids running around stepping on landmines isn't really going to make the villagers want to protect the Taliban much. So
mhm.
In addition
Yeah.
to being very deliberate in where they placed them, they were also courteous enough to typically mark the general areas of where they were.
Yeah, they would mark those areas, and some of them obviously went unmarked. The more like I think the more significant ones that were used is maybe like a defensive kind of perimeter around a particular mud hut or a particular
Right.
village. Those would be pretty well marked, and usually with a line of rocks. So if you saw that line of rocks, if you pop your head up over a wall and you see that line of rocks, you're like, "Oh shit! Like, are we inside the IED zone or are we outside of it?" And so that was always kind of a pucker factor for everybody to see that line because you never knew exactly where you're at. Because obviously, and this is unfortunately a lesson that was harshly learned, is we learned really quick not to take the roads because the roads were riddled with these natural choke points. A tree would be there, so the path would narrow down between the tree and the irrigation ditch, and there'd be an IED. Or you'd move into the village, and there'd be this bridge you have to cross. And so there'd be an IED on one side of that bridge. And so, you know, we talked about the grape huts earlier in the grape rows. We talked about these. Well, why are you guys out there climbing these walls? It was because we got pushed off the roads by the
Okay.
IED threat. And so we couldn't move quickly down these roads. Instead, we had to push off into these fields because we knew, they had limited resources. So they couldn't put an IED in every grape row because there was thousands of these things out there. And so we would walk the length of these, climb a wall, walk the length, climb a wall, walk the length. And then we would maybe shift up and down these parallel rows, try to change our pattern of movement. So we never used the same field twice. We never used the same row twice. And what that allowed us to do was actually move through the space relatively safe from the IED threat until we got to these choke points where we'd have to slow down and be really meticulous with how we tried to detect them.
Yeah, and so the our route selection, our kind of infantry IQ or our IED IQ as it kind of developed over the deployment is what primarily kept us safe from stepping on IEDs. But we also used equipment, mine detectors, metal detectors, that sort of things. And that was kind of like this other chess game that was happening on the side where we would develop a technology to counter a certain type of IED, and then the Taliban would figure out we could detect it, and they would make IEDs that didn't have metal in them, and then we would
Mhm.
have to make a metal detector or a IED detector that didn't look for metal, and so this constant battle back and forth about these technologies. And even the dogs, once they figured out we were using the dogs to look for IEDs, they started targeting dogs.
Yeah.
There's a real sad story in there. I'm sure we'll tell at some point, about them targeting a dog in RAO,
Yeah.
and the EOD. They knew to target EOD. So it was the Taliban may have been under-equipped, uh, but they were by no means an inept
No.
enemy. And if we didn't have air support, it would be a completely different kind of fight.
Yeah. Yeah. If we hadn't have had air support, then it would be a knockdown drag out for every village. So that's obviously a huge component of how we were able to successfully fight these guys was the air support because the toe to toe, even though we always had them, most of the time we had them outmanned and we always had them outgunned. We had more ammo and more guns than those guys could ever dream of.
Right.
For the most part, occasionally that might change, and those stories will come up too.
Yep.
But for the most part, we had them outmanned and outgunned. But we without that air support, it would have been just a really hard fight for us.
Yeah, it's kind of like our trump card. We were better infantry fighters in that environment, but they had the IDs. And then,
Yeah,
but so that kind of leveled the balance, the playing field. So we had to bring something else to the fight to kind of tip the balance back in our favor. And my favorite infantry term is that we don't fight fair. So everything we can bring to the fight to give us an advantage, we're going to. And the attack weapons teams made up the Apaches, or the scout weapon teams made up of the Kiowas, or the pink teams, which was a combination of the two, were absolutely invaluable in our
yeah,
in as many people as we got home is only because we were able to have those guys on a quick line.
yeah. So, this is kind of the introduction to the fight. Like this shape. I think this has shaped the mold for for people to kind of imagine the kind of fighting we had to do, and we'll get into the actual gun battles and the actual firefights later on. But one of the things that we need to address here in this inaugural episode is we need to discuss how the IED impacts the soldier, because our objective here is to tell the story of the infantrymen and these other soldiers that were with us in this daily grind. And the IED was this threat that was it really kind of settled into the recesses of your mind and how you thought about the next day going on mission or the next patrol. And over a period of months of dealing with these things, it began to have this kind of um, lingering sense of unease for every step that you took. You had this anxiety about every single step you took because it was this constant threat. A firefight's different. You can kind of mitigate a firefight. If you're taking machine gun fire from your right and there's a wall 15, and let's say there's a wall 5 feet to your front, you can run in, hop behind that wall, and more or less feel a little bit more better about the situation you're in.
Yeah.
But that IED, that puts that little voice in your mind that says, "Oh wait, there might be an IED on that wall. The Taliban might be pushing me into that wall with this machine gun fire, and then I lay down on that thing and I'm dead." And
Right.
so this is something that really kind of develops this unsettled feeling in the kind of gut of your stomach that you would have, the night before an operation or the night before a patrol that never quite left you, and
Yeah.
over a period of months of dealing with this threat, it takes a significant toll on the soldiers and their ability to fight successfully. And some guys, it affects guys differently, but it added a layer of mental complexity to our fight that if it wasn't there would have been a different kind of way for us to think about our presence there and how we moved in those spaces and everything.
Yeah. I mean, especially once people started stepping on them. I
Yeah.
feel like, initially we were trained, we did all this counter IED training. We knew they were there. We were told they were there, heard stories from the unit before us. But until we started hitting them or we started finding them,
Hmm.
it really didn't kind of click or register with us the meaning of that threat. Uh, you know, for better or worse, most people are kind of immune to most threats until they personally experience it.
Hmm.
And we had we had PFCs, private specialists handing them a $50,000 mine detector and being like, figure out how it works. You're in charge. You're walking in front. Like everyone's safety behind you now depends on you. So
Hmm.
instead of now, you're up front, so you don't have 50 people walking in front of you. You're likely going to be the first person to step on one. Not only
Yeah.
that, now if you miss it, let's say you step over it, but you missed it because you didn't find it, and somebody behind you steps on it, like now you have that guilt.
Yeah.
And so like it really instills this sense of duty and purpose behind it. But as someone who did it for like 6 out of 9 months, I could tell you like that duty and purpose went out the window as soon as you started to get tired. You hold these mine detectors and they're not very heavy, 15 pounds. But when you're holding 15 pounds with an outstretched arm, after an hour or two, just constant movement, constant sweeping, your mind is
Hmm.
constantly engaged. You're looking for indicators, you're looking for choke points, you're listening to directions from the guy behind you telling you where to go. And it just mentally and physically drains you to the point where that sense of duty that you had before you left the fob, like, yeah, I'm going to protect my people, just goes to, I just need to get home. And then
Yeah.
the longer it goes, it devolves into, I kind of just wish I step on one. And,
Yeah.
and I think,
That speaks to this mental fight, this mental toll that the ID threat had on us, and especially guys that were clearing. And I cleared a decent amount. You cleared quite a bit more than I did, but I cleared a lot. We had other guys who cleared more, and all these things are going through your head, and it speaks a lot to the mental state that you reach when you start to play the, well, if I step on one, and all we all did this. So this, for someone who wasn't there, someone who's uninitiated, the guys who lost their legs and the guys who lost limbs would definitely 100% agree, I think, with what we're saying here. But you
yep.
play this weird mental game, would that be all right? I think I'd be all right with that, if it got me out of here and it got me out of having to clear these fucking IEDs off the place. And then something I actually thought about just a couple days ago as we began to kind of piece this podcast together, I had this kind of resurgence of this memory that I hadn't really had in a long time. I had this series of thoughts. Let me stop for a second and get my fucking bearings. We can edit this. Okay. So the other day I had this thought and this kind of memory, and I was like, "Holy crap, I forgot about this," but I remember what it was like the night before, a big operation, or even just before a regular foot patrol. It didn't have to be a big operation. The night before patrol, and I would lay there in my bunk, and I would think like, "What would it feel like?" You know, what would it feel like to step on one of these things and get my legs blown off? And would I be in a lot of pain? Would I be so shocked that I couldn't feel pain? Like what is this state of between getting your legs taken off and getting put on a helicopter, getting to a hospital? Like what is that period of my life going to feel like? And that's a hard thing to overcome for soldiers and for a lot of guys.
Yeah. And it's that pre-mission panic, whether it's the night before or the morning of, is when like you really contemplate all these kinds of thoughts and wishes and urges and fears. And I can think of many times sitting on the HLZ getting ready to roll out, just thinking about like, oh, if we go here, we're gonna step there. And you know like you said, what is it gonna feel like? And especially after Clark got hit, and it became very, very real for at least our platoon, because it was there. And Clark is going to be one of our very first guests, so I'm not going to spoil any of his story. But probably more than anything to that point, him getting hurt kind of sombered our entire approach, and we didn't have to wonder that question as much anymore because we watched it happen.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And it's a difficult thing to convey to people, but that's what we're trying to do
Yeah,
here. But yeah, the IEDs were a son of a bitch, and we lost guys to them, and we've had guys get wounded, to varying degrees, and a lot of guys got seriously, just terribly wounded, um, because of these nasty little homemade bombs that were in the ground, made from plastic jugs, a couple pieces of wood, and a little piece of metal. And we won't go into details on how
yeah.
the IEDs were constructed. We don't want somebody taking it home with them, but it was very cheap and very easy to make, and
I know for me, the one of the bigger mind fucks with those homemade IEDs was how often we would find things that we left laying around, or things that we gave to
mm,
children used to make them, like the pens that we
yeah,
would give kids, or the water bottles that we would discard, or batteries that fell out of our stuff. And it got to the point where you know the backpackers here are gonna be super happy, but we were basically like trying to be leave no trace patrolling, because literally everything we
hmm
left behind, somebody had found in an IED.
yeah,
Especially the stuff that you give the kids, and it's when you're giving things to children, and you know that the children are participating in the insurgency against you, it really dehumanizes them, and it's a very dangerous thing
yeah.
when you're dehumanizing
Yeah,
children.
and these kids may not be violent. I mean, some of them undoubtedly were probably walking out like, "Hey, dude, this guy just gave me a pen. You said to bring these to you," and they
Hmm.
do.
Right.
But some of them, I'm sure they as soon as we left, Taliban walked out and snatched them up. Hey, we need this. And so these little kids, I always felt bad for the kids, and especially the girls.
Yeah.
That's an unfortunate life for someone to be born into. And I've always said if I ever adopted, I would adopt an Afghan girl. I don't even know if you can adopt out of Afghanistan.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
I don't think you can, but if you could, that's what I would do.
Yeah.
But yeah, and the Taliban, they were an insurgent, so they were in and among and part of the
Hmm.
population, and they wore civilian clothes. It's all everybody knows this about insurgencies now because that's more or less a household term in America after this 20-year war.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and like those kids, those, especially the younger boys, like those were their future soldiers. The
hmm
little boys that you and I were giving pens to, or high fiving in the villages, like they are fighting American soldiers and
Yeah.
Afghan soldiers in Panjwai and Zari and Helmand today.
hmm
Uh,
Yeah.
and you witness that radicalization. You can see it in some of them, and
Phew,
it's
yeah.
just it's difficult. And
Yeah. Yeah, you see this, in the different ages, you would see these different levels of interaction. The little kids were pretty friendly with us, and like the 4 and 5 year olds. But as soon as they get up in that 9 and 10, 11, 12 range, they kind of had a maliciousness about them,
Hmm.
especially the boys. The boys, never the girls. And by
Yep.
that point, the girls were being sequestered off
Right.
and held in the home, and they weren't allowed to walk around freely. Um, but the boys in that kind of preteen, early teenage years, they had this kind of malicious eye about them whenever they were interacting with us, and that sucks to sit there
Yep.
and look at a 10-year-old knowing like, okay, in 3 years you're probably going to be pecking around dad's PKM ammo. And it also, by the end of the deployment, we actually were like, because we had killed so many Taliban, we actually there's a few times where we saw younger men, younger males out there, that were maybe 15, 16 years old actually fighting us.
Well, I don't know if you remember when we low crawl day, which we'll talk about at some point. But
Hmm.
when we got into that village, and standard procedure was we would check for gunpowder residue on everybody there,
Hmm.
including the younger boys that down to a certain age. And I can't remember the age of the kid. He couldn't have been older than 10, and he had
Yep,
didn't
I
just have
remember.
gunpowder residue on him. It was on his hands. It was on his
Hmm.
forearm. It was on his cheek. So this wasn't
Hmm.
somebody that picked up a gun. This was someone that was shooting it at us.
Shooting at us, yeah.
And
And
that
that was, yeah. That was a day where we got, right before we pushed into that village and snatched that kid and his dad up,
Mhm.
we got hit close.
Yep,
It was a really close ambush, maybe probably 5 or 6 meters,
yep.
from the part of our unit that took contact. We won't spoil it,
Yeah.
but it was a long day, and yeah, that was kind of a weird moment. And so, for people who aren't familiar with the jargon, we'll try to stop ourselves and actually tell you what acronyms or what a particular slang thing is, because it's easy to fall into these patterns of this language. But we had what's called military age male, and for short, every once in a while you might throw out ma'am, but for the most part, military age male. And after that particular event, then when I began to think about military age males, it went from being grown men with beards to, that 12 or 13-year old. Does he fall into that category?
And I'm kinda glad we're doing this now, 8, 10 years or 8 years later, and not trying to tell as much of the story in 2013 when we just got back, because I think 2013 Curtis would have had a very different, approach to the Afghan population, the kids,
Mm,
the women. Not that I hated them, but I think at the time my perception was almost completely like they're all Taliban.
yeah,
And there was not
yeah.
much of a differentiation between the civilians and the people we were fighting, and a part of
Hmm.
that remains true. It is still difficult to differentiate a lot of that, but I think with this 8 years of hindsight, it's a little bit easier to have more empathy.
Yeah, it is for sure. And I think that's a result of our training,
Hmm.
at least maybe not now. I don't know how basic training is now, but it's 12 years ago when I went into basic training, like day one, it was like, you're here and you're going to learn to kill,
Right.
you know?
Yep.
So, infantry school is kill the enemy, kill, 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 kill,
Yep.
kill, kill. You hear kill all the time, every
Yep.
day. And they kind of breed this mind of yours to go out and kill people, which is important. It's part of the job. It's part of what you have to do. But so for us, when we got into this fight, it was this weird balance of like this breeding infantry mentality of, your job is to kill the enemy. But now we're working in and amongst this civil population, this civilian population, and these young kids and these wives and these families. Um, but also, we weren't really there in a coin fight. We weren't out there to win hearts and minds. The nature of our mission, which we can go into more detail, especially when we have our, Brian Kitching on. Sorry, sorry there, sir. If you're listening, keep messing up his last name. Anyways, when we have our CEO on, he's gonna be able to talk more about how we went out there and we fought. We pushed into these areas, so we had to balance this like really intense infantry fight with the Taliban, which was our purpose in being there, and that's a lot of what we did with not really fighting a coin fight, but not taking an objective either.
Yeah, I
And
think that was
so
a unique aspect of our fight. at that time because a lot of units were doing true coin, trying to like build
Hmm.
roads and build wells and develop rapport with the people. And whether we were supposed to be doing that and we just weren't, or I truly believe that our mission there was a little bit more of an interdiction mission,
Yeah.
and whether by necessity or just by intent. But we patrolled to make contact with the enemy, to push the enemy, to determine the ground, the to determine the battlefield on our terms, not on
Yeah.
theirs. And at the time, I hated it because I didn't want to go out there, and I didn't want to walk to Sketch, and I didn't want to walk to Najat. But
Hmm.
in hindsight, I am very proud of the work that we did as a company because I feel like we were bold and we were ambitious and we took the fight. And all the way up until the day before we left the COP, we were fighting the Taliban and we
Yeah.
were dictating the terms of that battlefield. And you know I'm super
Yeah.
proud of what we'd accomplished on that deployment.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think it's important in terms of visualizing the fight for people is a lot of our fighting went on to the east of our COP. And that was mostly because as we began to patrol, we just kind of tumbled into these Taliban cells that were really entrenched and really strong. And so about maybe I need to look at the map, just a couple clicks to the east of Sperwan Ghar, you had this line of villages that essentially ran on a north-south axis in the district. So
Mhm.
essentially, they ran on a north-south axis in this district. But also, what happened around these villages is you had a really dense. Um, the vegetation got really dense and tight, and so the Taliban could move in and out of these places relatively easy without having to worry about ISR or the Peaches balloons or whatever. And so, what was essentially created was this kind of, I don't want to say a stronghold, but an incredibly heavy presence of Taliban in this one chunk of our AO. And about 500 meters east of Sperwan Ghar was a Kalat and a tree line, and it was kind of like this magic line in the sand. And that as soon as you crossed that tree line, almost immediately you guaranteed to take contact
Mhm.
because you were getting into the western edge of that little chunk of Taliban strength that was
Right.
in that part of the AO that went all the way over to the other paved road south of the bazaar, and that's where the Najat and Sketcha and those villages were at.
Which is ironic because when we first got there,
Yeah,
the unit was more scared of the western portion of our AO. And
yeah,
not scared. Scared is the wrong word. They were more cognizant of the threat to the west. I'm not sure that the unit before us did a whole lot of patrolling to the east. I think they probably went to
yeah.
Adam's Eye, maybe Hajj Muhammad, down to Big and a little Big Reggae.
Mhm.
But I don't think they were doing foot patrols going several kilometers to the east, which is what we did. Um, which is a good segue into talking about what our next episode is going to kind of launch off with is uh, that threat to the west. So, Luke, please tell us about the mythos behind the 2-8 grid line.
So essentially, when we got to Sperwan, we were briefed right off the bat about this magical line called the 2-8 grid line to the west of Sperwan, and this unit that we were replacing, they said that every time they went past this point, so unlike the 500-meter line that was drawn out to the east of us, this 2-8 grid line out to the west of Sperwan, they said that they would start taking a lot of contact, and they got into the worst of their stuff kind of out in that area of their AO. And so one of the first things we did was start patrolling out into that area, and we were actually on the COP, and after we'd ripped in and the other unit had ripped out, uh, we were one of the first larger, kind of more significant patrols we did was to push past that 2-8 grid line and get out there and just kind of tickle them under the stomach a little bit and see what's going on. And and we definitely found out because it was on April 25th of 2012, and we had walked the roads. And we pushed out there just a straight line on this route, this
Oh, we don't
dirt
want to
dirt
spoil it. We're
road.
talking about it next week.
Yeah, I know. We pushed out there, and that is where we took our first contact, not just for the platoon, but for the company.
Yeah, and the the build up to that was just is pretty interesting because we had patrolled before. Most of it pretty close to Route Brown, some stuff in Adams Eye, a little bit of stuff off to the east, down to the south near Big Reggae, but we'd kind of gone to the safe spots to this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And this one, it was actually kind of a last minute change. I remember the night before them saying we're going to the 2-8 grid line, and the CO's coming with us. And this, I think this was the first patrol that Captain Kitching had gone with us on. So that one in of
Yeah.
itself was a clue that he kind of expected us to take contact. Besides the
Yeah.
fact that we already had been hearing about the 2-8 grid line, the 2-8 grid
Yeah.
line.
And I remember the night before, but after we kind of got that change in brief, like, hey, we're going out here. I remember they were like, okay, guys, like this is this is it. Like we're probably going to take some contact,
Yep.
and we knew going in we were going to get shot at. We were going to get in a firefight.
And also up to that point, we had been leaving pretty late in the morning, so like 8 or 9
Hmm.
a.m. And this was the first mission where we were leaving like at the crack of dawn, like right at 5, 6 a.m. So there was the opportunity
Yeah.
there that we were going to surprise them where they were before they had kind of a chance to set up for us.
Yeah. Yeah. And this was a tactic that we learned to adopt pretty quickly because it worked pretty well, and that we could be in and amongst them by the time they were getting out of bed. And so, the Taliban didn't fight at night. They knew not to come out and mess around at night because they knew we would whoop them if they did.
Yeah.
So we began to figure out, and the longer that walk was, the earlier in the night you left. So if that walk was a click and a half, you leave at 4:30. If that walk was 5 or 6 clicks, you leave at midnight. So yeah, um, yeah, this has been an interesting introduction to the beginning of this story.
Yep.
And next episode, stay
Yeah.
tuned.
It'll be next week for our normal listeners, but just a reminder that
Yeah.
if you are one of our Kickstarter listeners and we made our $5,000 goal, you are probably going to roll straight into episode number 2, 3, and 4 because those are now available to you. And thank you for your help.
Yeah. So yeah, episode 2, the first firefight.
Yeah, and I think just give you more of a preview. We'll talk about that for sure at length, and we'll start to dive into some of our more personal stories, and that will be the last Curtis and Luke only episode for a while. We promise.
Yeah.
Part of the reason we're doing these 2 episodes up front with just us is it gives us the opportunity to practice.
Yeah.
We're rusty. I'm sorry. And it also gives us a chance to make some content with the equipment that we have while we wait for the Kickstarter campaign to finalize and we can start really building out our capabilities.
And some ways that you guys can help us out. Even, if it's okay, you don't have to give us your money. We'll take it, but you don't have to give us your money. But little ways you can help us out, and it sounds kind of silly, but just subscribe. Subscribe to the podcast or follow the podcast on whatever platform you're using, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, especially. Just subscribe and like and do comments, and especially on like Instagram and YouTube, comment and like it, and like the podcast on whatever platform you're using. It'll jump it into the algorithm, and that'll help us gain some traction. And the more traction we gain, the better product and the better storytelling we can deliver to you all.
All right. Well, with that said, we'll see you next time.
Next time.